Universe Books. Answers about life. Universe Books presents, The Law and the Promise. By Neville Goddard, 1961. Chapter 7. Moods. This is an age in which the mood decides the fortunes of people rather than the fortunes decide the mood. Sir Winston Churchill. Men regard their moods far too much as effects, and not sufficiently as causes. Moods are imaginal activities without which no creation is possible. We say that we are happy because we have achieved our goal. We do not realize that the process works equally well in the reverse direction, that we shall achieve our goal because we have assumed the happy feeling of the wish fulfilled. Moods are not only the result of the conditions of our life, they are also the causes of those conditions. In The Psychology of Emotions, Professor Ribbett writes, an idea which is only an idea, produces nothing, and does nothing. It only acts if it is felt, if it is accompanied by an affective state, if it awakens tendencies, that is to say, motor elements. The lady in the following story so successfully felt the feeling of her wish fulfilled, she made her mood the character of the night, frozen in a delightful dream. Most of us read and love fairy stories, but we all know that stories of improbable riches and good fortune are for the delight of the very young. But are they? I want to tell you of something unbelievably wonderful that happened to me through the power of my imagination, and I am not young in years. We live in an age which believes in neither fable nor magic, and yet everything I could possibly want in my wildest daydreams was given to me, by the simple use of what you teach, that imagining creates reality, and that feeling is the secret of imagining. At the time this wonderful thing happened to me, I was out of a job, and had no family to fall back upon for support. I needed just about everything. To find a decent job, I needed a car to look for it, and though I had a car, it was so worn out, it was ready to fall apart. I was behind in my rent, I had no proper clothes to seek a job, and today it's no fun for a woman of 55 to apply for a job of any kind. My bank account was almost depleted and there was no friend to whom I could turn. But I had been attending your lectures for almost a year, and my desperation forced me to put my imagination to the test. Indeed, I had nothing to lose. It was natural for me, I suppose, to begin by imagining myself having everything I needed. But I needed so many things and in such short order that I found myself exhausted when I finally got through the list, and by that time I was so nervous I could not sleep. One lecture night, I heard you tell of an artist who captured the feeling, or word as you called it, of "Isn't it wonderful," in his personal experience. I began to apply this idea to my case. Instead of thinking of, and imagining every article I needed, I tried to capture the feeling that something wonderful was happening to me, not tomorrow, not next week, but right now. I would say over and over to myself as I fell asleep, "Isn't it wonderful? Something marvelous is happening to me now." And as I fell asleep I would feel the way I would expect to feel under such circumstances. I repeated that imaginary action and feeling for 2 months night after night, and one day in early October, I met a casual friend I hadn't seen for months, who informed me he was about to leave on a trip to New York. I had lived in New York many years ago, and we talked of the city a few moments, and then parted. I completely forgot the incident. 1 month later to the day, this man called at my apartment and simply handed me a certified check in my name for $2,500. After I got over the initial shock of seeing my name on a check for so much money, the story that unfolded seemed to me like a dream. It concerned a friend I had not seen nor heard from in more than 25 years. This friend of my past, I now learned, had become extremely wealthy in those 25 years. Our mutual acquaintance who had brought the check to me had met him quite by accident during the trip to New York last month. During their conversation they spoke of me, and for reasons I was not to know, for to this day I have not heard from him personally and have never attempted to contact him, This old friend decided to share a portion of his great wealth with me. For the next 2 years, from the office of his attorney, I received monthly checks so generous in amount they not only covered every necessary requirement of daily living, but left much over for all the lovely things of life, a car, clothes, a spacious apartment, and best of all, no need to earn my daily bread. This past month I received a letter and some legal papers to be signed which provide the continuation of this monthly income for the rest of my natural life. TK. If the fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Sir Winston calls on us to act on the assumption that we already possess that which we sought, to assume a virtue, if we have it not. Is this not the secret of miracles? Thus the man with palsy was told to rise, to take up his bed and walk, to mentally act as if he were healed, and when the actions of his imagination corresponded with the actions which he would physically perform were he healed, he was healed. This is a story about which some may say, it would have happened anyway, but those who read it carefully will find room to wonder. It begins 1 year ago, as I left Los Angeles to visit my daughter in San Francisco. Instead of the happy-natured individual she had always been, I found her in deep distress. Not knowing the cause of her anguish and not wishing to ask, I waited until she told me that she was in great financial trouble, and must have $3,000 immediately. I am not a poor woman, but I didn't have much cash I could put my hands on that quickly. Knowing my daughter, I knew she would not have accepted it anyway. I offered to borrow the money for her, but she refused, and instead, asked me to help her in my way. She meant using my imagination, for I had often told her of your teaching, and some of my words must have struck home. I immediately agreed on this plan with the provision that she would help me help her. We decided on an imaginal scene we could both practice that involved seeing money coming to her from everywhere. We felt money was flooding toward her from every corner, until she was in the middle of a sea of money, but we did this always with the feeling of joy for anyone concerned, and we had no thought of means, only happiness for all. The idea seemed to catch fire with her, and I know she was responsible for what happened a few days later. She was certainly transformed back to the happy confident mood that was natural to her, though there was no evidence of any real money coming in at the time. I left to return home in the east. When I arrived home, I called my mother, a lovely young lady of 91, who immediately asked me to come and see her. I wanted a day's rest, but she couldn't wait, it had to be now. Of course I went, and after greeting me, she handed me a check for $3,000 made out to my daughter. Before I could speak, she handed me 3 additional checks totaling $1,500 made in favor of my daughter's children. Her reason? She explained that she had suddenly decided the day before, to give what she had in cash to those she loved, while she was still here to know of their happiness in receiving it. It would have happened anyway? No, not like this. Not within days of my daughter's frantic need, and then her sudden transformation to a mood of joy. I know that her imaginal act caused this wonderful change, bringing not only great joy to the receiver, but to the giver as well. P.S. I almost forgot to add, that among the checks so lavishly given, was one for me too, for $3,000. MB. The boundless opportunities opened by recognizing the shift of the focus of imagining, is beyond measure. There are no boundaries. The drama of life is an imaginal activity in which we bring to pass by our moods rather than by our physical acts. Moods so ably guide all towards that which they affirm, they may be said to create the circumstances of life and dictate the events. The mood of the wish fulfilled is the high tide which lifts us easily off the bar of the senses where we usually lie stranded. If we are aware of the mood and know the secret of imagining, we may announce that all that our mood affirms will come to pass. The following story is by a mother who succeeded in sustaining a seemingly playful mood with startling results. Surely you've heard the old wives' tale about warts, that, if a wart is bought, it will disappear. I've known this story from childhood, but not until I heard your lectures did I realize the truth hidden in the old tale. My boy, a lad of 10, had many large ugly warts on his legs, causing an irritation which had plagued him for years. I decided that my sudden insight could be used to his advantage. A boy has a lot of faith in his mother as a rule, so I asked him if he would like to be rid of his warts. He quickly said yes, but he did not want to go to a doctor. I asked him to play a little game with me, that I would pay him a sum of money for each wart. This suited him fine, he said, he didn't see how he could lose. We arrived at a fair price, he thought, and then I said, now, I'm paying you good money for those warts, they no longer belong to you. You never keep property belonging to someone else, so you can no longer keep those warts. They will disappear. It may take a day, 2 days, or a month, but remember that I bought them, and they belong to me. My son was delighted with our game, and the results sound like something read in old musty books on magic. But, believe me, within 10 days the warts began to fade, and, at the end of 1 month every wart on his body had completely disappeared. There is a sequel to the story, for I bought warts from many people. They, too, thought it great fun and accepted my 5, 7, or 10 cents a wart. In each case the wart disappeared, but really, only one person believes me when I tell him, his imagination alone, took away the warts. That one person is my young son. Jr. Man imagining himself into a mood, takes on himself the results of the mood. If he does not imagine himself into the mood, he is ever free of the result. The great Irish mystic, A.E., wrote in The Candle of Vision, I became aware of a swift echo or response to my own moods, in circumstance which had seemed hitherto immutable in its indifference. I could prophesy from the uprising of new moods in myself, that I, without search, would soon meet people of a certain character, and so I met them. Even inanimate things were under the sway of these affinities. But man need not wait for the uprising of new moods in himself, he can create happy moods at will. Chapter 8. Through the Looking Glass. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye. Or if he pleaseth through it passe, and then the heavens spy. George Herbert. Objects to be perceived, must first penetrate in some manner our brain, but we are not, because of this, interlocked with our environment. Although normal consciousness is focused on the senses, and is usually restricted to them, it is possible for man to pass through his sense fixation into any imaginal structure which he conceives, and so fully occupy it that it is more alive and more responsive than that on which his senses stay his eye. If this were not true, man would be an automaton reflecting life, never affecting it. Man, who is all imagination, is not tenant to the brain, but landlord. He need not rest content with the appearance of things, he can go beyond perceptual to conceptual awareness. This ability to pass through the mechanical reflective structure of the senses, is the most important discovery man can make. It reveals man as a center of imagining, with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through a series of mental transformations in himself. Attention, the spearhead of imagining, may be either attracted from without, as his senses stay his eye, or directed from within, if he pleases, and through the senses pass into the wish fulfilled. To move from perceptual awareness or things as they seem, to conceptual awareness or things as they ought to be, we imagine as vivid and as lifelike, a representation as possible of what we would see, hear, and do, were we physically present and physically experiencing things as they ought to be, and imaginatively participate in that scene. The following story tells of one who went through the glass and broke the chains that bound her. 2 years ago, I was taken to the hospital with a serious blood clot condition, which apparently had affected the entire vascular system, causing hardening of arteries and arthritis. A nerve in my head was damaged and my thyroid enlarged. Doctors could not agree on the cause of this condition, and all their treatments were completely ineffective. I was forced to give up my every enjoyable activity and remain in bed most of the time. My body, from hips to toes, felt as though it was encased and bound by tight wires, and I couldn't put my feet on the floor without wearing heavy hip-length elastic stockings. I knew something of your teaching and tried very hard to apply what I had heard, but as my condition grew worse and I could no longer attend any of your lectures, my despondency grew deeper. One day a friend sent me a postcard, picturing the scene of a lovely beach by the ocean. The picture was so beautiful, I looked and looked at it, and began to remember past summer days at the seashore with my parents. For a moment, the postcard picture seemed to become animated, and flooding memories of myself running free on the beach filled my mind. I felt the impact of my bare feet against the hard wet sand, I felt the icy water running over my toes, and heard the crash of waves breaking on shore. This imaginal activity was so satisfying to me as I lay in bed, that I continued to imagine this wonderful scene day after day, for about 1 week. One morning I moved from my bed to a couch, and had started to sit up when I was seized with such an excruciating pain, my entire body became paralyzed. I could neither sit up nor lie down. This terrible pain lasted for more than a full minute, but when it stopped, I was free. It seemed as if all the wires binding my legs had been cut. One moment I was bound, the next moment I was free. Not by degrees, but instantly. VH. We walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7. When we walk by sight, we know our way by objects which our eyes see. When we walk by faith, we order our life by scenes and actions which only imagination sees. Man perceives by the eye of imagination or by sense. But two mental attitudes to perception are possible, the creative imaginative effort, which meets with an imaginative response, or the unimaginative staying of the eye, which merely reflects. Man has within him the principle of life and the principle of death. One is the imagination building its imaginal structures out of the generous dreams of fancy. The other is the imagination building its imaginal structures from images reflected by the chill wind of fact. One creates. The other perpetuates. Man must adopt either the way of faith or the way of sight. To the extent that man builds from dreams of fancy, he is alive, and, therefore, the development of the faculty to pass through the reflective glass of the senses is an increase of life. It follows that restricting the imagination by staying the eye on the reflective glass of the senses, is a reduction of life. The specious surface of fact reflects rather than discloses, deflecting the eye of imagination from the truth that sets man free. The eye of imagination, if not deflected, looks on what ought to be there, not what is. However familiar the scene on which sight rests, the eye of imagination could gaze on one never before witnessed. It is this eye of imagination and only this that can free us from the sense fixation of outer things which completely dominates our ordinary existence, and keeps us looking on the reflective glass of facts. It is possible to pass from thinking of to thinking from, but the crucial matter is thinking from, that is, experiencing the state, for that experience means unification, whereas in thinking of there is always subject and object, the thinking individual and the thing thought of. Self-abandonment. That is the secret. We have to abandon ourselves to the state in our love for the state, and in so doing, live the life of the state, and no more our present state. Imagination seizes upon the life of the state and gives itself to the expression of the life of that state. Faith plus love is self-commission. We can't commit ourselves to what we do not love. Never would you have made anything if you had not loved it. And to make the state alive, one must become it. I live, yet not I, God lives in me, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith, that this act of self-commission would transform the created into the creative. We must be imitators of God as dear children and commit ourselves to what we love, as God who loved us committed himself to us. We must be the state, to experience the state. The center of conscious imagining can be shifted, and what are now mere wishes, imaginal activities keyed low, brought into penetrative focus and entered. Entrance commits us to the state. The possibilities of such shifting of the center of imagining are startling. The activities concerned are psychical throughout. The shifting of the center of imagining is not brought about by spatial travel, but by a change in what we are aware of. The boundary of the world of sense is a subjective barrier. So long as the senses take notice, the eye of imagination is deflected from the truth. We do not get far unless we let go. This lady let go with immediate and miraculous results. Thank you for the golden key. It has released my brother from the hospital, from pain and probable death, for he was facing a fourth major operation with little hope of recovery. I was very concerned and attempting to use what I had learned about my imagination. I first asked myself what my brother truly desired. Does he want to continue in this body, or does he desire to be free of it? The question revolved itself over and over in my mind, and suddenly I felt that he would like to continue remodeling his kitchen which he had been contemplating before his confinement in the hospital. I knew my question had been answered, so I began to imagine from that point. Attempting to see my brother in the busy activity of remodeling, I suddenly found myself gripping the back of a kitchen chair I had used many times when something happened, then suddenly I found myself standing beside my brother's bed in the hospital. This was the last place I would have wanted to be, physically or mentally, but there I was, and my brother's hand reached up, and clasped my hand tightly as I heard him say, "I knew you would come, Joe." It was a well hand I clasped, strong and sure, and the joy that filled and spilled over in my voice as I heard myself say, "It's all better now. You know it." My brother didn't answer, but I distinctly heard a voice say to me, "Remember this moment." I seemed to awake then, back in my own home. This took place the night after he had entered the hospital. The following day his wife telephoned me saying, "It is unbelievable. The doctor can't account for it, Joe, but no operation is necessary. He's so improved that they have agreed to release him tomorrow." The following Monday my brother went back to his work and has been perfectly well since that day. JS. Not facts, but dreams of fancy shape our lives. She needed no compass to find her brother, nor tools to operate, only the eye of imagination. In the world of sense, we see what we have to see, in the world of imagination we see what we want to see, and seeing it, we create it for the world of sense to see. We see the outer world automatically. Seeing what we want to see demands voluntary and conscious imaginative effort. Our future is our own imaginal activity in its creative march. Common sense assures us that we are living in a solid and sensible world, but this so seemingly solid world is, in reality, imaginal through and through. The following story proves that it is possible for an individual to transfer the center of imagining to some greater or lesser degree, to a distant area, and not only do so without moving physically, but to be visible to others who are present at that point in space-time. And, if this be a dream, then, is all that we see or seem, but a dream within a dream? Seated in my living room, in San Francisco, I imagined I was in my daughter's living room in London, England. I surrounded myself so completely with that room which I knew intimately, that I suddenly found myself actually standing in it. My daughter was standing by her fireplace, her face turned away from me. A moment later she turned and our eyes met. I saw such a startled, frightened expression on her face that I, too, became emotionally upset and immediately found myself back in my own living room in San Francisco. 5 days later I received an airmail letter from my daughter, which had been written on the day of my experiment with imaginal travel. In her letter she told me she had seen me in her living room that day, just as real as though I were actually standing there in the flesh. She confessed she had been very frightened and that before she could speak, I had vanished. The time of this visitation, as she gave it in her letter, was exactly the time I had begun the imaginative action, allowing, of course, for the difference in time between the 2 points. She explained that she told her husband of this amazing experience and he insisted that she write to me immediately as he stated, "Your mother must have died or is dying." But I wasn't dead or dying, but very much alive and very excited by this marvelous experience. MLJ. Nothing can act but where it is, with all my heart, only where is it? Thomas Carlyle. Man is all imagination. Therefore, a man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. Imagination is active at and through any state that it is aware of. If we take shifting of awareness seriously, there are possibilities beyond belief. The senses join man in forced and unholy wedlock, to what were he imaginatively awake he would put asunder. We need not feed on sense data. Shift the focus of awareness and see what happens. However little we move mentally, we should perceive the world under a slightly changed aspect. Awareness is usually moved about in space by movement of the physical organism, but it need not be so restricted. It can be moved by a change in what we are aware of. Man is manifesting the power of imagination whose limits he cannot define. To realize that the real self, imagination, is not something enclosed within the spatial boundary of the body, is most important. The foregoing story proves that when we meet a person in the flesh, that his real self need not be present in space where his body is. It also shows that sense perception can be thrown into operation outside of the normal physical means, and that the sense data produced is of the same kind as those which occur in normal perception. The idea in the mother's mind which started the whole process going, was the very definite idea of being in the place where her daughter lived. And if the mother really were in that place, and if the daughter were present, then she would have to be perceptible to her daughter. We can only hope to understand this experience in imaginal, and not in mechanical or materialistic terms. The mother imagined elsewhere as being here. London was just as here to her daughter, living there, as San Francisco was here to the mother, living there. It hardly ever crosses our minds that this world might be different in essence, from what common sense tells us it so obviously is. Blake writes, I question not my corporeal or vegetative eye any more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it. This looking through the eye, not only shifts consciousness to other parts of this world, but to other worlds as well. Astronomers must wish they knew more of this looking through the eye, this mental traveling that mystics practice so easily. I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things, as cold earth wanderers never knew. Mental traveling has been practiced by awakened men and women since the earliest days. Paul states, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body I do not know, God knows. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 3. Paul is telling us that he is that man, and that he traveled by the power of imagination, or Christ. In his next letter to the Corinthians he writes, Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you? We need not be dead in order to enjoy spiritual privileges. Man is all imagination, and God is man. Test yourselves as this mother did. Sir Arthur Eddington said that all we have a right to say of the external world, is that it is a shared experience. Things are more or less real, according to the extent to which they are capable of being shared with others or with ourselves at another time. But there is no hard and fast line. Accepting Eddington's definition of reality as shared experience, the above story is as real as the earth or a color, for it was shared by both mother and daughter. The range of imagining is such that I must confess that I do not know what limits, if any, there are to its ability to create reality. All these stories show us one thing, that an imaginal activity implying the wish fulfilled must start in the imagination, apart from the evidence of the senses, in that journey that leads to the realization of desire. Chapter 9. Enter into. If the spectator would enter into these images in his imagination, approaching them on the fiery chariot of his contemplative thought, if he could make a friend and companion of one of these images of wonder, which always entreats him to leave mortal things, as he must know, then would he arise from his grave, then would he meet the Lord in the air, and then he would be happy. Blake. Imagination, it seems, will do nothing that we wish, until we enter into the image of the wish fulfilled. Does not this entering into the image of the wish fulfilled, resemble Blake's void outside of existence, which if entered into, englobes itself and becomes a womb? Is this not the true interpretation of the mythical story of Adam and Eve? Man and his emanation? Are not man's dreams of fancy his emanation, his Eve in whom he plants himself in all her nerves, just as a husbandman his mold, and she becomes his dwelling place and garden fruitful 70-fold? The secret of creation is the secret of imagining, first, desiring and then assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled until the dream of fancy, the void outside existence, is entered and englobes itself and becomes a womb, a dwelling place and garden fruitful 70-fold. Note well that Blake urges us to enter into these images. This entering into the image makes it englobe itself and become a womb. Man, by entering a state, impregnates it and causes it to create what the union implies. Blake tells us that these images are shadowy to those who dwell not in them, mere possibilities, but to those who enter into them, they seem the only substances. On my way to the West Coast, I stopped in Chicago to spend a day with friends. My host was recovering from a severe illness and his doctor advised him to move to a one-story house. Acting upon the doctor's advice, he had purchased a one-story house suited to his needs, but he now was confronted with the fact that there seemed to be no buyer for his large three-story home. When I arrived, he was very discouraged. In trying to explain the law of constructive imagining to my host and his wife, I told them the story of a very prominent New York woman who had come to see me concerning the rental of her apartment. She maintained a lovely city apartment and a country home, but it was absolutely essential that she rent her apartment if she and her family were to spend the summer at their country home. In previous years the apartment had been rented without any difficulty early in the spring, but at the time she came to see me, the season for summer sublets was seemingly over. Although the apartment had been in the hands of good real estate agents, no one had seemed interested in renting it. I told her what to do in her imagination. She did it, and in less than 24 hours her apartment was rented. I explained how she, by the constructive use of her imagination, had rented her apartment. At my suggestion, before she went to sleep that night in her apartment in the city, she imagined she was lying in her bed in her country home. In her imagination she viewed the world from the country house rather than from the city apartment. She smelled the fresh country air. She made this so real that she actually drifted off to sleep feeling that she was in the country. That was on a Thursday night. At 9 o'clock the following Saturday morning, she phoned me from her country home and told me that on Friday a highly desirable tenant, who met all of her requirements, not only rented her apartment but rented it on the one condition that he could move in that very day. I suggested to my friends that they build an imaginal structure as this woman had done, and that was to sleep imagining they were physically present in their new home, feeling they had sold their old home. I explained to them the wide difference between thinking of the image of their new house, and thinking from the image of their new house. Thinking of it is a confession they are not in it, thinking from it is proof that they are in it. Entering into the image would give substance to the image. Their physical occupancy of the new house would follow automatically. I explained that what the world looks like, depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observation. And man, being all imagination, must be where he is in imagination. This concept of causation disturbed them, for it smacked of magic or superstition, but they promised they would try it. I left that night for California, and the following evening the conductor on the train in which I was traveling handed me a telegram. It read, "House sold midnight last." 1 week later they wrote and told me that the very night I left Chicago they fell asleep physically in the old house but mentally in the new, viewing the world from the new home, imagining how things would sound if this were true. They were awakened that very night from their sleep to be told the house was sold. Not until the image is entered, until Eve is known, does the event burst upon the world. The wish fulfilled must be conceived in the imagination of man before the event can evolve out of what Blake calls the void. This next story proves that, by shifting the focus of her imagining, Mrs. A.F. entered physically into where she had persisted in being imaginatively. Soon after our marriage, my husband and I decided that our greatest joint desire was a year in Europe. This objective may seem reasonable to a lot of people, but to us, tied to a narrow sphere of limited finances, it seemed not only unreasonable but completely ridiculous. Europe might as well have been another planet. But I had heard your teaching, so I persisted in falling asleep in England. Why England necessarily, I cannot tell, except that I had seen a current motion picture featuring the area around Buckingham Palace, and had promptly fallen in love with the scene. All I did in my imagination was to stand quietly outside the great iron gates and feel the cold metal bars grip tightly in my hands as I viewed the palace. For many nights, I felt an intense joy at being there, and fell asleep in this happy state. Soon after, my husband met a stranger at a party, who, within 1 month, was instrumental in securing a teaching fellowship for him at a great university. Imagine my excitement when I heard the university was in England. Tied to a narrow sphere? Within another month we were crossing the Atlantic and our supposedly insurmountable difficulties melted as though they never existed. We had our year in Europe, one of the happiest years of my life. MF. What the world looks like depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observations. And man, being all imagination, must be where he is in imagination. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That stone is imagining. I acquaint you with this secret, and leave you to act or react. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold, for that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. George Herbert. My home is old but it is mine. I wanted the exterior painted and the interior redecorated, yet I had no money to accomplish either objective. You told us to live as though our desire is already a reality, and this I began to do, imagining my old house with a brand new coat of paint, new furnishings, new decoration, and all the trimmings. I walked, in my imagination, through the newly decorated rooms. I walked around the outside, admiring the fresh paint, and, at the end of my imaginal act, I handed the contractor a check for payment in full. I entered this imaginal scene faithfully as often as I could, during the day and each night before I fell asleep. Within 2 weeks I received a registered letter from Lloyd's of London, telling me I had inherited $7,000 from a woman I had never met. I had known her brother slightly almost 40 years before, and had performed a small service 15 years ago for the lady when this brother had died in our country, and she had written to me asking for particulars regarding his death, which I was able to provide. I had not heard from her since that time. Now, here was the check for $7,000, more than enough to cover the cost of my house restoration, plus many, many other things I desired. ECA. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lineaments and in stronger and better light than his perishing and mortal eye can see, does not imagine at all. Blake. Unless the individual imagines himself someone else, or somewhere else, the present conditions and circumstances of his life will continue in being and his problems recur, for all events renew themselves from his constant images. By him they were made, by him they continue in being, and by him they can cease to be. The secret of causation is in the assembled imagery, but a word of warning, the assemblage must have meaning, it must imply something or it will not form the creative activity, the word. Congratulations, you have finished the third part of this book. It can be said that you are unstoppable when you desire to achieve your goals. Continue to listen. People who succeed, have the habit to complete things. Please, share an insight that this book brought to you. Your point of view may help a lot of people. If you get tired, learn to rest, not to quit. Remember to download your ebook PDF and to subscribe as well. Thank you, we will meet again.